Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It began with the sunrise, but not the kind that warmed the face or gilded the horizon. In the spring of 536 AD, across much of the known world, the sun rose behind a veil. A dim circle in a white-gray sky, its rays fell without strength, casting no sharp shadows, giving no comfort. The world was lit, but barely, as if stuck in a long, cold twilight that would not end in Constantinople. The heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, court historian Procopius noticed it first as a vague unease. The days were oddly muted. The warmth of the season did not arrive. People began wearing thicker tunics, even in the months when grain should have been planted. And then came the words, quiet, at first, and then louder, that the sun no longer shone, not just here, in the capital, but across the empire. In the markets of Syria, the voices of merchants grew nervous. Crops that should have bloomed by now lay stunted. The sky had changed. It was as if the heavens themselves had turned against the earth. In Ireland, monks scratched notes into thin parchment, observing an unnatural dimness. In China, court records from the Northern Wei dynasty noted that the stars could be seen in daylight, and that frost appeared in midsummer. No one knew it then, but the world had entered one of its coldest, darkest periods in recorded history. And yet, no wars had been declared. No comets blazed overhead. There was no sound, no rumble of divine punishment. Just a strange and silent light, a light that made everything feel suspended. The historian Procopius, writing decades later, still seemed unnerved by what he had witnessed. He wrote, "During this year, a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness. And it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. No date was recorded, no celestial event, just a year of absence. Even he, steeped in the superstitions of empire and faith, could not explain it. He didn't try. Kay simply noted it, one sentence in a long chronicle of emperors and invasions, but that one line would echo elsewhere. Same quiet astonishment was taking hold. In Mesopotamia, scribes noted failing crops and cool winds from the west. In the monsoon lands of South Asia, the rains weakened, and high in the Himalayas, glacial patterns, though only noticed centuries later, shifted ever so slightly. But it was in the far north, and in the deep records of ice, that the earth itself had preserved the memory, because what no one knew in 536 was that something had happened far beyond the reach of any empire. Something volcanic, something explosive. Perhaps more than once, in the great frozen layers of Greenland and Antarctica, modern scientists would find traces of it. Layers of sulfur-rich ash and dust, sealed inside the polar ice like a sealed letter, waiting to be read. That letter was stamped 536 AD, but to those living in it, there were no instruments, no theories, only confusion. The sun was gone, and it would not return in full for almost 2 years. People responded in the only ways they could. In the Eastern Roman Empire, processions were held in the streets. Incense was burned, bells rung, icons were lifted toward the heavens. But the skies stayed blank in the countryside. Farmers whispered among themselves whether the emperor had displeased God, whether a demon had risen in the west, or whether a new star was about to fall. In China, the royal court consulted astrologers who offered vague reports about omens and disharmony between the heavens and the earth. Their predictions grew bleaker. Harvests were delayed. The common people began to worry, and the cold came early. Frost crept in during the spring of 536. By summer, the wind had teeth. Trees in parts of Europe bloomed only halfway, then died. Grain heads were small, damp, and rotten. In the highlands of Ireland and Scotland, entire families moved closer to the coast in search of warmth that never came. But it wasn't just cold. It was gray, lifeless. The wind didn't howl. It whispered. It whispered through the temple columns of Byzantium, through the reeds along the Nile, through the hanging banners of Chang'an, and it carried questions. No one could answer. What had it its son? Why was there no sign of a god's displeasure? And if the world could change this much, what else could disappear? In modern times, these records were often dismissed as exaggeration. Monks and scribes were prone to drama. Some scholars said, a cloudy year, a poor harvest. Political turmoil, perhaps, but the ice said otherwise. In the 1990s, teams studying ice cores from Greenland discovered a layer with extremely high sulfur content, a chemical fingerprint of a massive volcanic eruption, one large enough to throw vast clouds of ash and sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, where they would circle the globe, block sunlight, and alter climate for years. The layer matched 536 AD, and not long after, another similar layer, likely from a second eruption, was dated to just a few years later, in 540 AD. It was not a bad year. It was a cascade, a sudden, volcanic winter that dimmed the earth and reshaped history in ways we're still uncovering. But in 536 no one knew that. All they saw was the light dying in the sky, and in that dimness, stories began to take root. Some said dragons had swallowed the sun. Some said demons from the outer lands had thrown a veil over the sky. Others believed that a god had turned his face away, not in anger, 'cause something had ended, and no one knew what would begin. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian would soon face the first waves of a plague that would kill tens of millions. In Ireland, population collapse and famine would be etched into the genealogies. In China, dynasties would fragment and reform. Floods and droughts twisted the land. But in this first moment, the first year, it was simply question. What do you do when the sun no longer rises? Where do you go for warmth when even the temples are cold? And what do you plant when you no longer know if the seasons will return? In that long twilight of 536 AD, the world waited not for a prophet, not for a war, but for the sky to remember how to shine. And for many, it never did. It is difficult to imagine the sound of a world losing its warmth. There is no single moment, no thunderclap of finality, no bright flash like lightning, just the long, soft rustle of a season that never arrives, and a quiet, slow rearranging of human lives around that absence. By the middle of 536 AD, across much of the northern hemisphere, people had begun to realize that the cold was not going away. In the villages and farmlands of what we now call Europe, the ground had already turned strange beneath their feet. Seeds were planted, but the earth remained stubborn. Shoots emerged, hesitated, and curled back into themselves, as if shrinking from an invisible breath. By midsummer, entire fields had failed. Those that survived bore stunted grains and spoiled fruit, the kind that twisted inside the stomach. Livestock, already lean from the end of winter, began to starve by summer's peak. This was not a sudden famine. It was quieter, less violent. It crept in what is now Ireland. Analysts, likely monks trained in observation, recorded, in short, severe phrases that a failure of bread had begun. That same phrase would appear again and again across monastic margins and parchment scraps, always without explanation, as if no explanation was needed, because when you wake each day to the same dim light, the same strange chill in the wind, the same silence in the trees, You stop asking questions. You start counting. Counting the remaining bags of grain. Counting the mouths in the household. It's counting the weeks left before it might turn warm. But it never did. In Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the cold silence took a different shape. There was no shortage of knowledge in the empire. Scholars could read the stars, measure time with instruments, chart the courses of eclipses and comets. But none of it explained this. The emperor's court held days of prayer, fasts, and public lamentations. Statues of saints were paraded through the avenues. Incense drifted through the open-air courtyards of Hagia Sophia, but the gray light continued to fall, unchanged. Some whispered that Justinian himself had offended God. Others looked beyond the city, toward Persia or the steppes, wondering whether this was a spell, a curse, an act of magic more ancient than Rome. But no army had come. No prophet had spoken. Only the cold in the countryside. The silence deepened. Peasants dug deeper wells, hoping for better water. Trees, once thick with summer leaves, began to lose their color far too early. Children played less, cried more, and fell ill with mysterious fevers. Mothers watched them with growing fear, wrapping them in extra cloth, even in July, in China. The imperial records of the Northern Wei and Liang dynasties painted a similar portrait. Farmers reported frost in midsummer. Crops withered before the harvest. Even the great Yellow River, always a source of life and destruction, seemed to change. Flooding in odd rhythms or shrinking prematurely. In some provinces, entire towns relocated temporarily, seeking slightly warmer ground. There was no real escape. The dimness was not a local curse. It was everywhere. The stars remained visible during the day, and when the wind changed, it carried with it a fine gray dust that settled on rooftops and skin. No one had seen the eruption. No one knew the name of the mountain, not yet. But its ash had wrapped the earth, and the world, unknowingly, had entered one of its most difficult decades. Famine was not new. Every generation had faced lean years, bad harvests, or sudden disasters. But this time, the losses were compounded by uncertainty, because this was not a single bad year. It was two. And even those who survived the first dark season had little left for the next. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence would later reveal mass burial sites dated to this exact window. Sites where hundreds were interred, many of them children and the elderly, stacked and arranged hastily, often with no grave goods. It was not war, it was something quieter. A culling by a weather dot. In the Alps, glacier ice recorded unusual levels of copper and lead, evidence that mining and metalworking had ceased almost completely. Commerce slowed. Trade roads emptied. The cold didn't just freeze the land, it froze society, and it had consequences far beyond famine. Without food, economies slowed. Without warmth, diseases spread more easily. And without clarity, people turned inward toward fear, suspicion, and silence. In the highlands of Armenia and the Georgian foothills, mountain communities isolated themselves. Monasteries, once open to travelers, closed their gates. In Alexandria and Jerusalem, disputes broke out over the meaning of the darkness, whether it was a test, punishment, or the beginning of revelation. In some places, small cults began to rise. Wanderers who claimed they had heard from the angels or read secret signs in the dim sun. Some called for fasting. Others called for war in the vacuum of certainty. Belief became dangerous, but not everywhere. In some parts of Syria and Mesopotamia, villages responded with cooperation. Grain was pooled, livestock redistributed. Monks wrote instructions for preserving food longer. And those scrolls were passed quietly from town to town. There are even records, fragmentary but touching, of families sheltering travelers who had lost everything. Of priests offering milk to hungry children from monasteries, animals, of a fragile kindness surviving in the dark, in a letter from a bishop near Edessa. He writes, "Though the sky remains cold, the Lord warms us with the fire of neighborly mercy." But for most, survival was not poetic. It was logistical. Families broke apart, not from hatred, but from strategy. Sons sent south, daughters married to merchants with access to reserves, parents who stayed behind, guarding small gardens, hoping the frost would lift out, and still, the sun did not rise. There were no major battles that year, no dramatic events, just a slow erosion of what had once felt certain. By early 537 AD, rumors of another harvest failure were circulating. But worse than that was the fatigue. Fatigue, not just in the body, but in the soul. People stopped counting days, stopped noting feast dates, stopped listening for the bells in some monastic calendars. The ink fades slightly across the winter months of 536 into 537, not because of weather, but because fewer monks were available to copy. Some had died, some had left, some had simply lost the will to record a world they no longer understood. This was the real silence of 536, not just the sunless sky, but the hush of disbelief. And yet, life did not end. In a remote hilltop village in Wales, a charcoal fire was kept alive each night by a boy named Iago, who would grow into a storyteller. In a small village east of the Rhine, a woman pressed dried apples into a paste to preserve them through the weeks. In the Nile Delta, a fisherman cast nets even as the waters cooled and caught enough to keep his family alive. There was always movement, always someone planting, baking, weaving, trying, even in the quiet, even in the cold. And when the summer of 537 passed with the same dim sky and bitter wind, no one asked anymore if it would end. They just adjusted. The fabric of tunics thickened. Meals shrank to roots. Beans, broth. Children learned to go to bed early. The elderly no longer told stories of before, because it only brought sorrow. The world had changed, and no one could say if it would change back in later years. Scribes would look back and call it Annus Tenebrosus, the year of darkness. But it was more than a year, and it was more than dark. It was the moment when history paused, when humanity, for a breath in time, huddled together beneath the sky that had forgotten how to shine, when the earth forgets how to grow, when light turns pale and warmth vanishes. People look up, not because they expect answers, but because everything else below has failed. In the year 537 AD, to 2 years of failed summers, most people no longer looked for explanations. They looked for survival. But in monasteries, courts, marketplaces, and remote stone huts, theories began to gather, slow as snowfall, layered and hushed. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a guess, and none of them knew how close or how far they were from the truth. The Roman historian Procopius, writing from the court of Emperor Justinian, observed the sun's strange behavior in a careful, almost reluctant tone. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Procopius was no mystic. He was a bureaucrat and chronicler. He did not speak in omens, but even he could not resist recording the eerie sight, a daylight that felt like dusk, a warmth that never came. Later, chroniclers would repeat the same idea with more fear in Syria. John of Ephesus described a year without shade because the sun was too dim to cast it. In Italy, Cassiodorus, a senator turned monk, called it a portent of the last days. And in the far corners of Asia, the Chinese Book of Sui recorded yellow dust falling like snow, crops that failed even under the emperor's blessing. But beyond what was written, more curious stories took root. Some believed the sun had been struck by a great arrow fired by angels or demons, depending on which story you heard. Others said the sun had hidden his face out of shame or grief, or because God had turned his back in the eastern Mediterranean. So one theory began to spread like a soft echo that the light was being swallowed. Not all at once, like an eclipse, but slowly, bit by bit, as though the sky itself were being eaten. Monks debated whether this was symbolic or literal. In some surviving margins, drawings show strange diagrams, circles shaded by layers of ink, lines radiating in uneven spirals. Some imagined a giant canopy, like a heavenly tent, descending between the sun and the earth. Was it dust, a veil, the hand of the divine? In the absence of tools, theories grew like vines, twisting around faith, fear, and fragments of memory. The people who lived in forests and hills, the ones without parchment or Latin, had different explanations in old Gaelic traditions, which would later become part of Irish legend. A tale circulated of the Fomorians, a race of ancient beings who lived in the sea and hated the sun. According to the story, they had risen again and sent cold winds over the land to reclaim the world for darkness. Some said the Fomorians had stolen the sun itself and buried it beneath the sea. It was not science, but it was comforting in its own way. It gave the cold a face. It gave the dimness a villain. And that, more than truth, often keeps people steady. In the eastern steppe, across the lands once ruled by the Huns, people told a different tale, that a mountain had cracked in the far north, and that its soul, made of smoke and sorrow, had escaped into the sky. Some said the gods of the mountain had died, and the ash was their funeral rite. Others believed the ash was punishment for forgetting the old rites. And in Japan, where court scribes meticulously recorded celestial signs, records note a mysterious red haze and frost in summer, though the cause was never named. But what really happened? For centuries, no one knew. Even modern historians struggled. The 536 to 537 darkness remained a mystery deep into the 20th century. It left no clear mark, no massive crater, just a long silence in the sun. Then, quietly, sneeze, caught up with myth, glacial cores, long cylinders of ice, drilled from Greenland and Antarctica are some of the Earth's oldest memory keepers. Layer by layer, they hold centuries of trapped air, dust, tate, and volcanic ash. And in the cores dated to 536 AD. Researchers found something shocking: a sudden, thick layer of sulfate aerosols, the chemical signature of a massive volcanic eruption. The type of eruption that doesn't just bury nearby villages, but blots out the sky. And this was not the ash of a single volcano. Further down, around the year 540, another, even denser layer appears, suggesting that two massive eruptions occurred within just a few years of each other. It was not one disaster, it was a sequence. Double blow to the atmosphere, the first in 536, second around 540, that plunged the world into a volcanic winter. Today, many scientists point to this sequence as the most likely explanation for the Black Sun years. But where were the eruptions? Here the mystery deepens. For decades, no confirmed source volcano was found. No great ring of devastation. No collapsed caldera to match the timing. Some suggested Iceland, with its massive volcanic record in proximity to Europe. Others looked toward Central America or Indonesia in 2018. A new clue emerged: tephra, or volcanic glass, embedded in European ice cores. The composition pointed toward an eruption in the tropics, possibly in modern-day El Salvador or Indonesia. One strong candidate: the Ilopango volcano in El Salvador. A massive eruption there, known as the Tierra Blanca Jovan event, 8, had been tentatively dated to around the 6th century. If true, it could explain the dust veils, the failing crops, the red skies. But the debate continues, even now with satellite models, and geochemical analysis, we cannot say with certainty which volcano darkened the sky. And so, in a way, the people of 536 knew as much as we do. They didn't need ice cores. They saw the same gray light, felt the same cold, and they told their own stories. But the consequences didn't end with crops by 541 AD. The Eastern Mediterranean, already weakened by famine and confusion, would be struck by another horror plague. The first outbreak of bubonic plague in recorded history began in the port of Pelusium and spread across the empire like spilled ink. Justinian's empire, already shaken by the cold, lost perhaps a third of its population in a few years. Some cities never recovered. It is not a stretch to say the volcanic starkness set the stage for one of history's most devastating pandemics, and in its wake, borders shifted, kingdoms collapsed, and new powers slowly emerged from the cold. But the people of 536, 537, and 538 did not know they were living through the hinge of history. To them, it was just ... cold, just quiet, just another strange morning without shadow. And when the skies finally cleared, slowly, without fanfare, they had already changed their habits. They no longer trusted summer, no longer planted as much, no longer waited for brightness. Oh, generation was shaped by the absence of warmth, and their children grew up hearing stories of a world where the sun had once burned strong, but then left like a god whose patience had worn out. We live in a time of electric clocks and satellites. Our ancestors watched the sky with just as much reverence, and when it darkened, they listened to the earth, to each other, and to the slow beat of survival. That's how the story of 536 survives, not in fire, but in Ashdod, not in conquest, but in quiet, a quiet that still echoes in the ice. Before Egypt was finished writing its last chapter, before Greece had built its temples, and before Rome was more than a muddy village of huts, a kingdom rose along the curve of the Nile. Its people carved temples from sandstone cliffs, built pyramids that still stand today, and minted coins in gold, while much of the ancient world still traded in grain and cattle. But centuries later, they were gone from most maps, their stories overwritten, cleased, or renamed, confused or dismissed by the world's most famous historians. This kingdom was Nubia, and even now, much of its history has been erased. The Nile is a long river, not just in distance, but in memory. For many, it ends at Egypt, its temples, its pharaohs, its familiar script and painted tombs. But travel farther south, past Aswan, past the cataracts that ripple like ancient staircases, and you reach the land once called Kush, Kor, or Nubia, a land with kingdoms as old as the pyramids and stories just as rich, though seldom told. To the north, the Egyptians saw Nubia as both rival and source. It was the place where gold came from, ivory, ebony, ostrich feathers, incense, warriors, women with straight backs and braided hair, kings who dressed like gods, and queens who sometimes ruled alone. At first, the Egyptians raided them. Then they copied them, 'cause, for a time around the 8th century BCE, the pharaohs of Egypt were Nubian. It is one of the quieter facts in history that a group of kings from the south, often called the 25th dynasty, marched north and took control of Egypt, not as invaders, but as restorers. They saw themselves as defenders of tradition, as faithful stewards of a man, the old god, as the ones who would return Egypt to its former glory. They ruled from Thebes and Napata. They wore the double crown. They built temples and left inscriptions. But then, they were pushed out, and when new rulers rose from the Delta, from Persia, from Greece and Rome, the memory of Nubia's rule was slowly softened, then scratched away by the time the historians of Europe began writing grand narratives of civilization. Nubia had become a footnote, its pyramids buried in sand, its queens renamed, its power forgotten. But how did Nubia begin? And why was it erased? To understand that, we have to go back further before the 25th dynasty, before Egypt's decline to the time of Kerma. Kerma is one of the oldest known urban centers in Africa, side of Egypt. It flourished from around 2500 to 1500 BCE, the same centuries when Egypt was building its middle and new kingdoms. But Kerma was not a copy of Egypt. It was its own thing. Massive mud brick architecture, sacred cattle burials, rich graves filled with faience, bronze, and even imported objects from the Levant. Their kings were buried with dozens of servants and wives. Their soldiers carried bows so strong that Egyptian texts later warned about them, calling Nubians the archers of the south. They were not barbarians. They were a civilization. The city of Kerma had a central structure called the Western Tefufa, a tall, rectangular temple made of mud brick, some 60 feet high. It still stands, eroded and worn. In the Nubian desert, when archaeologists uncovered it in the early 20th century, they were stunned. Not because it was Egyptian, because it wasn't. It showed that high civilization, trade, religion, statecraft had developed independently in sub-Saharan Africa, not merely as an offshoot of Egypt, but in parallel. It was an uncomfortable truth for many early archaeologists to accept. So, instead, some dismissed Kerma as an Egyptian colony. Others suggested it had been ruled by Egyptian elites, but the graves said otherwise. The artifacts, styles, and burial practices were distinct. Kerma was not a shadow. It was a rival. In around 1500 BCE, Egypt knew it. That's when Pharaoh Thutmose I launched a brutal campaign into Nubia. His armies burned Kerma, seized its treasures, and declared the region conquered. For the next few centuries, Egypt ruled parts of Nubia directly. Temples were built. Egyptian art and religion spread southward. Nubian princes were educated in Thebes, trained in Egyptian ways. But conquest does not erase memory, and even while Egypt held the region, the people of Nubia did not forget their past by the time Egypt began to falter. Around 1100 BCE, two Nubian rulers were asserting themselves again. New capitals rose. One was Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. Another later was Meru, a city farther south, surrounded by iron smelters and pyramid fields. These cities would carry the torch of Nubian civilization long after Egypt fell under foreign rule. But their names, too, would vanish from most textbooks by the time of the Greeks and Romans. Nubia was a curiosity. Strabo, the Greek geographer, mentions the Ethiopians, a term then used broadly to describe darker-skinned peoples south of Egypt. He notes their wealth, their queens, or distant lands, but he does not name their cities. He does not describe their pyramids. Even as the kingdom of Meru sent diplomats to Rome, even as their queens led armies and resisted invasions, they were rendered anonymous in Mediterranean records. Later historians, writing centuries later, often bundled Nubia into vague terms like Ethiopia or the land of the blacks. Details faded, dates blurred, and soon Nubia's history was no longer told. Not because it wasn't there, but because someone, or many someones, decided it wasn't worth remembering. And yet, if you walk the sands of northern Sudan today, the remnants of that forgotten kingdom remain. More pyramids than in all of Egypt. Narrower, steeper, but still rising. Temples with inscriptions in Meroitic script. A writing system still only partially deciphered. Depictions of women with royal crowns. Queens with war axes. Rulers giving offerings not to Egyptian gods, but to their own. It's all still there. Not in museums, but in dust, waiting. The desert was never silent. It only waited for someone to listen. Long after the empire of Meru had crumbled into the sands, long after its warrior queens had vanished from living memory, and long after the temples had cracked beneath centuries, of sun, the stones still held their breath, whispering secrets in a language no one had spoken for 1,000 years. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, those whispers began to rise again. The rediscovery of Nubia was not a single event. It wasn't led by a triumphant archaeologist posing with the trowel and the headline. It was slow, inconvenient, boring, and it began, as such things often do, with confusion. European travelers, missionaries, colonial officers, scholars had long assumed that Egypt marked the uppermost boundary of African civilization. Beyond the first cataract of the Nile, they believed, lay nothing but nomads in sand. So, when explorers reached sites like Gebel Barkal or Meru and found pyramids, dozens of them, they were baffled. Ethiopian pyramids, they called them, or Black Pharaohs. They were unsure of what they were seeing, certain it must be an offshoot of Egypt. It didn't occur to them that this might be something older, something parallel, something African in its own right. But then came the names, on crumbling temple walls and half-buried stelae. Scholars began noticing inscriptions that were not hieroglyphs. They were not Greek or Latin either. They were written in Meroitic, the native script of the Nubian kingdom. It had an alphabet, system, a rhythm, and no one could read it. To this day, you still can't. Meroitic is one of the great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world, alongside the Indus Valley signs. In the Rungo glyphs of Easter Island, we know what it sounds like because the symbols can be matched phonetically, but we don't know what most of the words mean. The language behind the writing has vanished. The people who spoke it are gone, and yet the words remain carved into sandstone, on altars buried beneath the dust of 20 centuries. In the 1920s, British archaeologist George Reisner began systematic excavations across Nubia. He documented royal tombs, covered temples, and mapped the architecture of a civilization that had once stretched from present-day Sudan into southern Egypt. He was methodical, brilliant, and flawed. Reisner, like many of his contemporaries, viewed Nubian civilization as a derivative of Egypt, a decadent imitation in his words. He believed that Nubia borrowed its culture, its religion, and its architecture wholesale from its northern neighbor. But the artifacts told a more complicated story. Iron tools, pottery styles, decorative motifs, burial customs, indigenous deities. This was not Egypt's shadow. It was its neighbor, its rival, its reflection. Still, the myth persisted. Nubia remained a footnote in the grand narrative of ancient history. When Western museums displayed artifacts from Sudan, they were often misattributed or buried in dusty drawers. Pyramids, like those at Meru, were rarely taught in classrooms. School children learned about Ramses and Cleopatra, but not Amon-Arenas or the Candaces who ruled with spear and crowned. Even as archaeological work expanded in the mid-20th century, funding and attention flowed elsewhere. There were few documentaries, fewer books. Nubia remained half visible, a civilization glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Then came the flood in the 1960s. Egypt and Sudan embarked on a massive project, the construction of the Aswan High Dam. It was an engineering marvel, but it came with a price. The dam would create a vast reservoir, Lake Nasser, which would submerge hundreds of archaeological sites along the Nile Valley. Many of these sites were in Nubia, temples, tombs, villages, places that had stood for thousands of years would vanish beneath the water. And so, in a rare moment of global cooperation, UNESCO launched the Nubian Salvage Campaign, one of the largest archaeological rescue efforts in history. For a brief time, the world looked south. Temples were dismantled stone by stone and moved to higher ground. Artifacts were cataloged, shipped, preserved. Entire settlements were studied before they disappeared forever. Some monuments, like the Temple of Abu Simbel, were saved. Others were not. But the campaign brought attention. Scholars from dozens of countries, Egyptologists, African historians, linguists turned their gaze toward Nubia, and what they found reshaped the story. Ironworking, for instance, had flourished in Meru centuries before it became widespread in Egypt. The kingdom had become a major center of smelting, producing weapons, tools, and trade goods that traveled deep into Africa and the Middle East. Its economy was complex, its artistry refined. Its queens continued to appear in murals and statuary, shown in powerful, triumphant poses, and most importantly, its language persisted, even if we couldn't yet understand it. In recent decades, Sudanese archaeologists have taken the lead. Excavations are now being directed by local experts, researchers who grew up near these ruins, who know the soil, the stories, the rhythms of the land. Their work has uncovered new royal tombs, new inscriptions, new clues to the Meroitic script. Linguists are using AI to search for patterns in the text. Satellite imagery is revealing long-lost cities buried beneath the desert, and slowly, quietly, the forgotten kingdom is returning to memory. But erasure is stubborn. Tourists still flock to Giza, but few visit Meru. Maps still highlight the Nile's northern wonders, but rarely its southern roots. In Western textbooks, the history of Africa south of Egypt often begins with colonialism, as if the continent lay dormant for millennia. But if you stand before the pyramids of Meru at dawn, when the sky burns orange and the air is still, you will see something older than Cairo, older than Rome, older than any lie told in silence. You will see stones that once sang with ceremony. You will see tombs that still hold the breath of a queen. You will see a name waiting to be spoken again, and perhaps you'll wonder, how many other histories have we forgotten? How many empires lie just beneath the surface, not crushed, not destroyed, but quieted, waiting for a listener, waiting for you, for you. The desert was never silent. It only waited for someone to listen. Long after the empire of Meru had crumbled into the sands, long after its warrior queens had vanished from living memory, and long after the temples had cracked beneath centuries of sun, the stones still held their breath, whispering secrets in a language no one had spoken for 1,000 years. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, those whispers began to rise again. The rediscovery of Nubia was not a single event. It wasn't led by a triumphant archaeologist posing with a trowel and a headline. It was slow, inconvenient, boring, and it began, as such things often do, with confusion. European travelers, missionaries, colonial officers, scholars had long assumed that Egypt marked the uppermost boundary of African civilization. Beyond the first cataract of the Nile, they believed, lay nothing but nomads in sand. So, when explorers reached sites like Gebel, Barkal, or Meru and found pyramids, dozens of them, they were baffled. Ethiopian pyramids, they called them, or black pharaohs. They were unsure of what they were seeing, certain it must be an offshoot of Egypt. It didn't occur to them that this might be something older, something parallel, something African in its own right. But then came the names on crumbling temple walls and half-buried stelae. Scholars began noticing inscriptions that were not hieroglyphs. They were not Greek or Latin either. They were written in Meroitic, the native script of the Nubian kingdom. It had an alphabet, a system, a rhythm. No one could read it. To this day, we still can't. Meroitic is one of the great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world, alongside the Indus Valley signs and the Rongo glyphs of Easter Island. We know what it sounds like because the symbols can be matched phonetically, but we don't know what most of the words mean. The language behind the writing has vanished. The people who spoke it are gone, and yet their words remain carved into sandstone, etched on altars buried beneath the dust of 20 centuries. In the 1920s, British archaeologist George Reisner began systematic excavations across Nubia. He documented royal tombs, uncovered temples, and mapped the architecture of a civilization that had once stretched from present-day Sudan into southern Egypt. He was methodical, brilliant, and flawed. Reisner, like many of his contemporaries, viewed Nubian civilization as a derivative of Egypt, a decadent imitation, in his words. He believed that Nubia borrowed its culture, its religion, and its architecture wholesale from its northern neighbor. But the artifacts told a more complicated story. Iron tools, pottery styles, decorative motifs, burial customs, indigenous deities. This was not Egypt's shadow. It was its neighbor, its rival, its reflection. Still, the myth persisted. Nubia remained a footnote in the grand narrative of ancient history. When Western museums displayed artifacts from Sudan, they were often misattributed or buried in dusty drawers. Pyramids, like those at Meru, were rarely taught in classrooms. School children learned about Ramses and Cleopatra, but not Amadarenas or the Candaces who ruled with spear and crown. Even as archaeological work expanded in the mid-20th century, funding and attention flowed elsewhere. There were few documentaries, fewer books. Nubia remained half visible, a civilization glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Then came the flood. In the 1960s, Egypt and Sudan embarked on a massive project, the construction of the Aswan High Dam. It was an engineering marvel, but it came with a price. The dam would create a vast reservoir, Lake Nasser, which would submerge hundreds of archaeological sites along the Nile Valley. Many of these sites were in Nubia, temples, tombs, villages, places that had stood for thousands of years would vanish beneath the water. And so, in a rare moment of global cooperation, UNESCO launched the Nubian Salvage Campaign, one of the largest archaeological rescue efforts in history. For a brief time, the world looked south. Temples were dismantled, stone by stone, and moved to higher ground. Its artifacts were cataloged, shipped, preserved. Entire settlements were studied before they disappeared forever. Some monuments, like the Temple of Abu Simbel, were saved. Others were not. But the campaign brought attention. Scholars from dozens of countries, Egyptologists, African historians, linguists turned their gaze toward Nubia, and what they found reshaped the story. Ironworking, for instance, had flourished in Meru centuries before it became widespread in Egypt. The kingdom had become a major center of smelting, producing weapons, tools, and trade goods that traveled deep into Africa and the Middle East. Its economy was complex, its artistry refined. Its queens continued to appear in murals and statuary, shown in powerful, triumphant poses. And most importantly, its language persisted, even if we couldn't yet understand it. In recent decades, Sudanese archaeologists have taken the lead. Excavations are now being directed by local experts, researchers who grew up near these ruins, who know the soil, the stories, the rhythms of the land. Their work has uncovered new royal tombs, new inscriptions, new clues to the Meroitic script. Linguists are using AI to search for patterns in the text. Satellite imagery is revealing long-lost cities buried beneath the desert. And slowly, quietly, the forgotten kingdom is returning to memory. But erasure is stubborn. Tourists still flock to Giza, but few visit Meru. Maps still highlight the Nile's northern wonders, but rarely its southern roots. In Western textbooks, the history of Africa south of Egypt often begins with colonialism, as if the continent lay dormant for millennia. But if you stand before the pyramids of Meru at dawn, when the sky burns orange and the air is still, you will see something older than Cairo, older than Rome, older than any lie told in silence. You will see stones that once sang with ceremony. You will see tombs that still hold the breath of a queen. You will see a name waiting to be spoken again, and perhaps you'll wonder, how many other histories have we forgotten? How many empires lie just beneath the surface, not crushed, not destroyed, but quieted, waiting for a listener? waiting for you, for you. Beneath the marble floor of a crumbling sanctuary in central Greece, a slow breath once rose from the earth. Invisible, sweet-scented, strange, it carried messages from gods. It blurred the line between the living and the dead. And for over 1,000 years, that breath, that strange vapor, passed through the lungs of one woman at a time, the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi. In the final centuries of her long and shadowed life, she sat alone more often than not. The crowds had grown thin, the offerings modest. But still, she waited above the ancient stone vent on a three-legged stool, with laurel leaves in hand, and she listened to the earth, to the silence, to the fading voice of Apollo. Once, Delphi had been the very center of the world, not in some poetic metaphor, quite literally. The Greeks called it the Ompolis, the navel of the earth. A carved stone marker still sits near the ruins of the temple, a dome-shaped relic said to have been dropped by Zeus himself after he released two eagles from opposite ends of the world and watched them meet over the slopes of Mount Parnassus. This was Delphi, the place where the sky met the land, where the gods leaned in close, and for a long time the gods spoke. No one is entirely sure when the oracle began. Some say it started as a shrine to Gaia, the earth goddess, long before Apollo arrived. The earliest records speak of a serpent who guarded the site, called Python, a being of prophecy and primeval knowledge. Apollo, the youthful god of light, is said to have slain the Python and claimed the sacred spot as his own. From then on, the oracular power belonged to him and to his voice on earth. The Pythia, she was always a woman, not always young, not always old, sometimes a noble, sometimes a peasant, but always chosen. She would prepare with rituals, fasting, bathing in the sacred spring, chewing bay leaves. Then, once a month, on the seventh day, she would descend into the temple's inner chamber, where the divine breath seeped from the ground. There, seated above the fissure in a small subterranean chamber called the Auditon, she would inhale and speak. Her voice didn't boom or tremble. It drifted, warbled. Often it made little sense. A priest would stand beside her, listening carefully, transcribing what he heard. The results were rarely direct answers. They were riddles, puzzles, words bent like branches in wind. And yet, cities waited on them. Kings launched wars because of them. Colonies were founded, treaties forged, battles abandoned. What the Pythia said, the gods had said. And so, Delphi became more than a sanctuary. It became a crossroads of influence, a vault of political secrets. Even Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, spoke of the oracle's centrality. He tells us that when Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, considered attacking Persia, he consulted Delphi first. The oracle replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Croesus took it as a sign of victory. He crossed it. He lost everything. It was his own empire that fell. And yet, what's fascinating is how many doubted the Pythia even then. Skeptics have always surrounded Delphi. Some claimed the priests coached the oracle, feeding her the political leanings of the powerful. Others whispered that bribes shaped her riddles. Still others insisted she was mad or simply high, because beneath the temple, something was rising to something chemical. For centuries, the story persisted that sweet-smelling vapors came from a fissure beneath the temple, vapors that put the oracle into trance. But when archaeologists began excavating the site in the early 1900s, they found no such vent, no strange gases. Many scholars dismissed the entire tale as a myth, but the Earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. In the 1990s, a team of geologists and archaeologists returned to Delphi with new tools and new questions, and what they found astonished them. The Temple of Apollo, sits on the intersection of two major geological faults, the Delphi Fault and the Kerner Fault. Where they meet, the rock beneath fractures, and through these fractures rise natural gases. Among them, ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon that, in certain concentrations, induces euphoria, disorientation, can trance-like states. In other words, the gods had chemistry on their side. Of course, this doesn't explain everything. The words still had to come from somewhere. The riddles still had to reflect politics, culture, myth, but it adds a layer of depth to the mystery, and perhaps a quiet respect for the women who took on that role. Imagine it. You sit alone in a stone chamber, barely lit. The air turns thick, warm, strange. Your heart beats faster. Your mind wavers. And outside, an impatient general is waiting for a sign. And you must speak for a god by the 4th century CE. The days of Apollo were numbered. Rome had adopted Christianity. Pagan temples were being closed, and the old gods no longer held power in the empire's eyes. In 393 CE, the Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree banning pagan rituals, including prophecy. The temple of Apollo was shuttered. The oracle stopped. The breath fell silent, and the Pythia, whoever she was, became the last. No one knows her name. There were hundreds before her, maybe more, but the final one is lost to us. She may have spoken one last time, or perhaps she sat in silence, listening to a god whose voice had already faded. What she felt, what she saw, what she said or didn't say, we will never know. But imagine the silence that followed, a silence that outlived empires, stretched from the marble steps of Delphi to the modern day, a silence still lingering, and perhaps the question that remains is not what she said, but why we stopped listening. The wind changed over Delphi in the late 4th century, not the wind that stirred the olive trees or whispered across Mount Parnassus, but something deeper, a cultural wind, a political one that came with marching boots and the slow extinguishing of torches once lit in the names of Apollo, Artemis, Athena. By 390 CE, the vast machine of the Roman Empire no longer paid its respects to the temples. The gods who had once held sway over law, harvest, birth, and war were now relics. Christianity had become not only legal, but dominant. And in a sweeping decree, Emperor Theodosius I made it plain. Paganism was no longer welcome in the world. He ruled. The sanctuaries were shuttered, the altars smashed, the fires extinguished, and in Delphi, the temple of Apollo was closed. But did the Pythia still sit there, waiting for just a little longer? Did she hope the gods might speak one last time? It is easy to imagine the collapse as sudden, but that's rarely how history unfolds. Even as the imperial edicts spread, local customs clung to their rhythms. The townspeople near Delphi had depended on the sanctuary for more than prophecy. It had drawn travelers, generated wealth, stabilized the region's significance. You didn't just walk away from that because of a new faith from far-off Rome. Instead, there was drift. Some of the old rites continued in secret. Some of the temples simply emptied. No fanfare, no torchlit final ceremony. Just forgottenness. The records from this time are thin, but scattered writings suggest that the oracle didn't stop immediately. A few sources claim a final Pythia uttered one last prophecy, not in the smoky murmur of the god's voice, but in clear lamentaton. As the story goes, a man came to the sanctuary one last time, seeking a vision. The oracle told him simply, "Tell the king that the great hall has fallen silent. Apollo has no house, no mantic laurel, no speaking spring. The voice is stilled." A clear farewell. Whether she truly said it or it was written in retrospect, no one knows, but it reflects something undeniably true. The ancient voices had gone quiet, and yet, even in their silence, they remained. not in temples, not in ritual, but in stone. The ruins of Delphi became ruins in layers. Some parts were repurposed, blocks taken from temple walls to build houses or churches. Other portions were swallowed by time, buried by landslides, overgrown, forgotten. Still, travelers came, pilgrims of a different kind, not to seek prophecy, but to glimpse the echoes of it. By the 6th century, Delphi had become a small Christian village. Its people no longer feared Apollo or paid homage to Dionysus. The bones of that sacred past lay under their feet, and maybe, just maybe, the back of their minds, it would take more than a millennium for the world to remember. In the late 19th century, French archaeologists arrived in Greece with a singular goal: to uncover the buried past of Delphi. But there was a problem. The village of Castri sat directly atop the ancient sanctuary. To dig, they would have to move an entire town. And somehow, they did. The people of Castri were relocated to a nearby site, and the excavation began slow, meticulous, reverent. As the layers were peeled away, Delphi returned. The theater, carved into the hillside. The treasuries, built by ancient city-states to honor Apollo. The long, sacred way, where pilgrims once climbed with offerings in hand. And at the center, the remains of the temple of Apollo, weather-worn, broken, but unmistakable. Even then, something was missing. For years, scholars debated whether the legendary fissure ever existed. Early archaeologists had found no sign of it. The romantic tale of the gas-induced trance seemed to be myth, another poetic embellishment, they thought, layered onto an already mysterious past. But geology had other plans. In the 1990s, as you recall from the last section, scientists returned with better tools. They discovered that the temple was indeed built over a junction of tectonic faults, cracks in the limestone through which gases could rise. Among those gases, ethylene. It wasn't imagination, okay? It wasn't just story. There had been something in the air. So we find ourselves in a strange place between myth and memory, science and superstition. The Oracle of Delphi, for so long dismissed as allegory, stands as a kind of ancient fusion between the spiritual and the natural. And at the center of it all was the Pythia, not a goddess, not a puppet, but a woman, one chosen to breathe the earth's breath and speak the words of gods or kings or something in between. Her life was ritual, her words were weighted, and her name, in the end, was never recorded. What would it have felt like to be the last, the final link in a chain going back centuries, maybe 1,000 years? Imagine stepping into the dim chamber, knowing the edict had been passed, that the priests were gone, that the crowds would no longer come, and yet the fissure still breathed. Did she inhale once more? Did the trance come? Did she speak? Or did she simply sit there, as the warmth left the stone, as the air grew still? There is a kind of grief in endings that don't announce themselves. The final. Pythia may not have known she was the last. She may have thought the sanctuary would reopen, that the gods would find new ways to speak, that the silence was only temporary. But, as history reminds us, the end of an age is often quiet. No trumpet, okay? No scream. Just a stillness that grows until it becomes the new normal. Today, tourists walk the paths once trodden by emperors and peasants alike. The sacred way still wins. The broken columns still stand. The stones bear scorch marks from ancient offerings. The breeze still rustles the bay trees sacred to Apollo. But no one speaks for the gods here anymore. No one listens for the hiss beneath the floor. And yet, for those who stop, who stand still long enough, who let the noise of the modern world fall away, something faint remains. Not a voice, not a riddle, but a question. What happens to prophecy when no one is left to hear it? And if the gods do fall silent, is it because they left, or because we stopped believing they were ever speaking at all, at all. There is a kind of memory held in stone. It does not shout. It does not change. It simply waits. Through earthquakes, empires, in erosion, the limestone of Delphi remembers. And as we step into the final echoes of the oracle's world, we must walk not only through the ruined columns, but through the minds of those who tried to preserve what they could not bear to lose. Not just priests and scribes, but poets, philosophers, and emperors. Because Delphi was never just a place of prediction. It was where the Greeks, and later the Romans, went to face the uncertainties of life. They didn't go to be told the future. They went to be given a language for their fear. The oracle, as a mirror of the power of the Delphic oracle, did not lie in accuracy. It lay in ambiguity. Her prophecies were famously double-edged, the most cited example being Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, who was told, if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. He crossed, flew, and his own empire fell. But the oracle had not lied. She had spoken with a precision, just not the kind he assumed. This was the genius of the Pythia's utterances. They made you confront your own bias, your own desires, your blind spots. In a way, she was less a prophet than a philosopher. And maybe that's why, even after the temple was abandoned and the laurel leaves left to wither, Delphi remained alive in writing the afterlife of a shrined Christian. Historians like Eusebius and Lactantius wrote of the oracle not to preserve her memory, but to refute her power. They framed her final prophecy, Apollo has no house, as proof that the old gods had conceded defeat. The temples had fallen, the spirits had fled, and the world now belonged to a new god. But even in condemning her, it kept her name alive. Later, during the Renaissance, a different kind of scholar rediscovered the texts. Ancient manuscripts were copied, debated, annotated, and in dusty studies across Europe. Men who never set foot in Greece debated the words of women who had sat above sacred gases centuries before. The irony was unspoken, but profound. The oracle, who had fallen silent, became louder in history than she had ever been in life. Women without names. One of the great tragedies of Delphi's story is how little we know of the Pythias themselves. We know the role, know the rituals. We know that she fasted, bathed in the Castalian spring, chewed bay leaves, and sat on a tripod above the chasm, but we do not know their names. These were real women, chosen often from the older population of the town, women past childbearing age, who had lived long enough to understand suffering, humility, and patience. They were not necessarily well-born, but they were considered sacred while in service, and yet not a single Pythia has survived in the record with a full biography. They spoke for the gods, but we lost their own voices. The archaeologists, delimiting the modern excavations of Delphi, scholars have walked a fine line. On one hand, they are dealing with one of the richest historical sites in Europe. On the other, they are interpreting ruins shaped as much by mythology as by mortar. The Temple of Apollo was rebuilt multiple times. The remains we see today likely date from the 4th century BCE, centuries after the oracle first rose to fame. What this means is that even the most iconic elements, the tripod, the fissure, the laurel wreath, must be approached carefully. Were they symbolic, functional, invented after the fact? Science has answered some of these questions. Geology revealed the presence of gases. Residues found on ceramics suggest rituals involving burning herbs. But no one has found an inscription reading, "Here sat the Pythia." We are left with fragments, and yet the fragments speak to the sight of endless questions walked through. It's Delphi today, and you pass more than ruins. You pass questions. Why did the Greeks believe the Earth's center was here? Why did so many leaders, even skeptics, seek the oracle's word? Why was prophecy entrusted to an aging woman in a patriarchal world? And, most curiously, Why did the practice endure so long? The Delphic oracle was active for over 1,000 years. That's longer than most religions have existed. Longer than many civilizations. Something about the experience resonated, not just in a spiritual sense, but in a deeply human one. To ask a question, to receive an answer you didn't expect, and to sit with that discomfort. This is not just ancient ritual. This is timeless introspection, a legacy in words, not stones. When the temple fell silent, the world moved on. But the Delphic maxims endured. Etched into stone near the sanctuary were short commands, pithy, powerful. Know thyself, nothing in excess. Surety brings ruin. They read like fortune cookies now, but they were deeply serious moral instructions. They were not just for supplicants, but for society. Some scholars believe they predate the oracle. Others think they were offered as philosophical interpretations of what the oracle represented. Either way, they remain carved into memory, occasionally into modern tattoos. The end of a voice. We often imagine history as punctuated battles, treaties, proclamations. But Delphi ended in a whisper. The last priestess likely did not know she was the last. The final prophecy may not have been written down. The sacred spring kept flowing. The bay leaves kept growing. But the voice was gone. And yet, Delphi is not silent. Every time a historian asks why empires believed a woman's voice was sacred, the oracle lives. Every time a visitor stands among the stones and listens to the wind, the past breathes. And every time someone reads the words, know thyself, the silence breaks. Because in the end, the oracle was never about the gods. She was about the question, reflection. Perhaps this is why she still lingers in the imagination. In an age of answers, she offered ambiguity. In a world of speed, she demanded stillness. And in a culture where power spoke loudly, she whispered. So ask yourself now, not as a historian, what as a listener? What questions would you ask if you had sat before her? And what if the answer was not what you wanted, but what you needed? You'll be brave enough to hear it. So much of ancient Egypt's history was not just about building legacies, but about reshaping them, adjusting memory, altering the past ever so slightly so that the present would feel permanent. The story of Setiamhat, the general whose tomb was hidden far from its intended home, is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how Egypt remembered its heroes, and how it forgot them. When memory was a weapon in the modern world, we often think of memory as passive, a record, a preservation. But in the Nile Valley, memory was active. It could be written, yes, in ink or stone, but it could also be unwritten, scraped away, its faces recarved, whole generations removed from family lists, like fallen stones from a crumbling wall. The Egyptians even had a word for this, damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. Though Latin came later, the concept was deeply Egyptian, and it was not always cruel. Sometimes, forgetting was an act of mercy. A general who served loyally, but stumbled at the wrong time. A nobleman who angered a new king, but at once saved a temple. To destroy them completely would have been dangerous, even blasphemous. Instead, they were made quiet, moved, filed into the archives of the dead, where only time would remember. Seti-M-Hat, it seems, was one of these. The evidence buried in the stone over a century after the anonymous tomb in Abydos was discovered. Researchers returned with more modern tools. This time, they were armed with portable X-ray fluorescence scanners, hyperspectral cameras, and 3D modeling software. But the goal remained the same: to find the story under the silence. In a narrow side room of the tomb, where the plaster had long fallen away, a faint outline was found beneath the surface. A chisel pattern, shallow, hesitant, suggesting a cartouche had once existed there. The shape fit a throne name common during Seti, the first reign, Minmater. If true, this was significant. It implied that the tomb was built during or just after Setii's rule, but that the name had later been removed. Nearby, another team found fragments of a limestone offering slab, broken and used as flooring. One piece showed the top of a feathered crown, another, the toe of a sandal. Both carefully rendered, both discarded. This was not destruction. This was editing, that as if someone had quietly removed the general's chapter from the book. I had forgotten to throw away the bookmark. Letters from a military household in a museum archive in Berlin. A dusty bundle of papyri labeled Misk. Official was re-examined in 2018. Inside were several poorly preserved letters written in hieratic, the cursive script used by scribes for daily records. One of them, barely legible, caught the attention of a graduate student working on military logistics. It was a letter from a quartermaster at Pyrameses, the great Delta capital, built by Ramesses II, requesting additional grain and linens for the house of the second commander. The letter included a note that the general of the South Road had not returned to court, and that his household is to be maintained, though his favor is now in question. The name was smudged, but the title, General of the South Road, matched the one found on a broken shapti from the Abbadah's tomb. Could this be Setium? Possibly. The letter suggests the general had fallen from political favor, but had not been executed. His family still received supplies. His home was still recognized. He was erased, but not destroyed. Pharaoh's fear of legacy. Ramesses II, known later as Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for 66 years. He built colossal statues of himself. He inscribed his name on temples he didn't construct. He even retroactively claimed victories in battles that were, at best, stalemates. He was obsessed with permanence. But, like all pharaohs, he feared one thing most: being forgotten. This made generals like Setium both valuable and threatening. General who led men into foreign lands became a symbol, a man of action, a name sung by soldiers, remembered by villagers. And sometimes those memories grew too large. There is no direct record of Ramesses erasing Setium. But he did reorganize the military hierarchy early in his reign. He promoted his sons to high posts. He replaced several commanders with palace loyalists, and he ordered a review of temple inscriptions, a subtle purge, not a bloodbath. Re-scripting. The quiet role of the priests in ancient Egypt. The priesthood often acted as the custodians of memory. They kept records. They performed rites for the dead. They maintained tombs, or let them crumble. Some priests were royalist in loyalty. Others were more local, quietly sympathetic to fallen figures. In the tomb of Setim, several small signs suggest a priestly hand intervened after the general's disgrace. A faded symbol of Ptah, god of craftsmen, on a support column, carved in haste. A broken faience amulet buried in the corner, scribed with a protective spell. Traces of incense found in the sarcophagus chamber. Long after the tomb's apparent sealing deeds were not honors, they were gestures, tokens of remembrance left by someone who had not forgotten. Perhaps a family priest, perhaps an old soldier, perhaps no one important at all, but they mattered. In Egypt, even a whisper could preserve a soul. The geography of Eurasia. Why Abydos? Why bury the general so far from his intended resting place? Part of the answer lies in geography. Abydos was ancient, older than Memphis, older than Thebes. It was where Egypt's first kings were buried. It was sacred to Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. A burial here was not a punishment. It was relocation. More importantly, it was out of the way. By the 19th dynasty, Abydos was no longer politically central. It was respected, but remote. A place where things could be slept alone. moving Sechemhat's tomb here ensured that he could still rest, but he would not be visited. Not by pilgrims, not by poets, not by future pharaohs. Just the wind, tea, and time. Why the past refuses to stay silent. What is most fascinating about this story is not the tragedy of the general, but the resilience of memory. He was erased from monuments, moved from his place of honor, his name scratched away, his praises undone, but not completely. A chipped plaque in a village wall, a letter in a Berlin archive, a tomb that didn't quite fit the pattern. These things linger, and they speak. In the soft light of a forgotten tomb, in the scratch of a scribe's hand, in the broken stone beneath a tourist's foot. A general is still remembered, even if no one says his name. In Egypt, every stone tells a story, and even the stones meant to stay silent eventually speak. The tomb at Abydos, anonymous and unassuming, sat untouched for centuries beneath a layer of dust, drifted sand, and deliberate forgetting. But forgetting in Egypt was rarely permanent. It was a pause, a breath, and eventually someone would draw near again. This final part of Setiemhat's story is not just about how his name was buried. It's about how, through slow persistence, it returned. Rediscovery in a century of doubt. The early 20th century was a golden age for excavation, and a reckless one. In 1913, a team from the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology mapped an unmarked tomb complex near Abydos. Most tombs in the region were well documented, tied to specific dynasties or priesthoods, but this one seemed unfinished. The burial chamber was narrow but deep. The walls bore faint traces of paint, mostly red ochre, once used to depict military garments. A single shapty figure had survived looting, bearing the word command, no cartouche, no name. The team moved on, but a German expedition in the 1950s returned to the site, intrigued by its odd mixture of modesty and military motifs. They removed layers of debris from a side chamber and found a sealed niche containing a broken myth, Ushapti mold. It bore the glyphs, Seti, WRMD, loosely, Seti, Great One of the Western Road. Alas, were partially chiseled, but legible enough. The general had resurfaced, the forgotten role of road generals in Egypt's 19th dynasty. Roads were more than paths. They were arteries of empire. The South Road, for example, connected Thebes with Nubia. It moved gold, incense, war chariots, and tribute from vassal kingdoms. A general of the road didn't just guard it. Seti-M-Hat would have overseen supply depots, toll checkpoints, border garrisons, and temple deliveries. He would have settled disputes between local chiefs. He may have even supervised diplomatic exchanges with Kushite envoys. Yet, like so many roles in ancient history, his title carried no monument. Only footprints on stone, ledger entries, fragments of jar labels. His importance was logistical, the kind of power that quietly frightens kings. A man who made armies move, who knew the weight of grain, the cost of rest, the time it took to cross deserts. And such men, while rarely praised in public steely, were often remembered in private. Echoes in the letters of a vizier in a 1960s archive. Consolidation in Cairo papyri from several older collections were recombined. Among them, a batch of correspondences from a high official under Ramesses II. The vizier, likely Panizi or Pacer, wrote to the temple treasurers at Umbu regarding an irregularity in military burial protocol. One line stood out. The tomb of the southern general is not to be built in Pyramidus. The favor of the Lord Pharaoh has shifted. He is to be granted rest, but not glory. This quiet sentence might explain everything. Not a command to execute, not even to shame, just a redirection, a whisper of judgment. Burial in Abydos, a reconsidered honor why choose Abydos for exile, 'cause to the Egyptians, even exile had to be dignified. Abydos was where Osiris's body was believed to be buried. To be buried, there was to be near resurrection. It was a place where forgotten people might still be judged kindly in the afterlife. So, perhaps Seti Mot's relocation was not entirely political, okay? Perhaps it was a compromise. The pharaoh could erase his name from the northern records, okay? But the priests of Abydos would still whisper his soul into the ears of Osiris. A hidden funeral, an anonymous tomb, but a peaceful afterlife. In this way, Seti-Mot's story mirrors those of many ancient figures caught in the tide of royal favor. Not quite traitors, not quite heroes, just inconvenient memories. Excavation notes in the margins. Excavation logs from the 1970s reveal a fascinating pattern. The deeper chambers of the tomb, especially the central shrine, showed signs of later modification. Stone blocks had been replastered, floor levels adjusted, paint schemes altered in ways that didn't match the original layers. Archaeologists realized this tomb was not left unfinished. It had been edited like a rewritten manuscript. The general had perhaps begun a larger monument for himself, but after his fall from favor, the design was curtailed. The larger chapel was sealed, the procession hall converted into storage. Only the inner sarcophagus chamber remained active. It was a tomb cut short, not by death, but by decree. The bones speak slowly in 2003. The remains inside the central sarcophagus were analyzed by osteoarchaeologists. The bones were partial, not complete. Several ribs, a jawbone, a fractured left femur, partially healed. The skeleton belonged to a man aged 50 to 60. He had arthritis in both knees, likely from horseback or chariot travel. His left shoulder had deteriorated, possibly from repeated armor wear. And most telling, his frontal skull bones showed remodeling indicative of a head injury suffered earlier in life, and survived. The injuries matched a warrior's career, not a battlefield death, but a life of repeated strain. He had lived long, served long, and, if records are to be believed, died quietly, far from the court. The bones were not wrapped in gold, no elaborate masks, but they were carefully placed, aligned westward, facing Sira. Whoever buried him, enemy or friend, had done so with care. A tomb for today in 2020. A joint Egyptian-French mission began restoring the outer chambers of the Abydos tomb. For the first time, lighting was installed to reveal the faint mural fragments, sandals, bows, chariot wheels in one corner. A nearly invisible scene emerged under laser scanning. A kneeling man before a figure of Seti I, his arm raised. In salute, the man had no name, but his posture was respectful. His uniform bore the stripes of a commander. This might have been the general, immortalized in the act of deference to a king whose son would later remove him. In irony, now uncovered. Hey, reminder, history often buries its contradictions. In sand, the cost of not being remembered. What does it mean to almost disappear? Setsi-Mat's story was not one of rebellion. He did not try to seize power. He did not betray the pharaoh. He simply fell out of step. Maybe he supported the wrong ear. Maybe his influence grew too strong. Maybe he knew something too valuable, and so his name was stripped from temple lists. His tomb repurposed, his family forgotten. But history is not perfect. A glyph survives on a mold. A letter remains in a forgotten drawer. A fracture in a femur tells a tale of marching long roads. And we remember, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that even those erased from power still shape the world they left behind. You've heard the story? Twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf. City founded on blood and brotherhood. Romulus and Remus. Rome was born, but that's not quite how it began. Long before the twins were even a tale, there was another founder, one with no myth, no divine parentage, just legacy, roads, and power. A man whose name was carved in early stone, spoken in trade routes, whispered by kings, and later erased. This is the story of the man before Romulus, the real founder of Rome, in the effort to forget him, the forgotten city of Alba Longa. To understand how Rome began, you must leave Rome, travel southeast, along the Alban hills, to a place once called Alba, Longa. It was older than Rome, richer too. Its hilltop fortresses overlooked fertile valleys. Its priests claimed descent from Aeneas himself. The Trojan exiles' families, the so-called gens, were said to have ruled the Latins before Rome was even mud and straw. Alba Longa was where kings were made. Rome was where they sent their youngest sons to learn discipline, according to Livy. Alba Longa was the seat of a dynasty that would eventually birth Romulus, but Livy was writing centuries later. By then, the true legacy of Alba Longa had already been buried beneath Rome's grand retelling. So, who led Alba Longa in those early centuries? His name was Silvius, and he wasn't alone. The Silvian lineage, the lost kings of Latian Roman history, remembers the Silvian kings as ancestors of Romulus, but their reigns are treated as background noise, placeholders between Aeneas and Rome's founding. There were many: Aeneas, Silvius, Tinus, Silvius, Albus Silvius, Capitus, Silvius, Tacitus, Silvius, who drowned in the river, later named after him. They were real names, preserved in early Roman annals and temple calendars. Some ruled for decades. One established the first councils among Latin tribes. Another built the earliest bridges across the Tiber. But when Rome rose, these men were reduced to myth fragments. Till one, Numitor Silvius, remained, cast as the grandfather of Romulus, deposed by a wicked brother. The rest were quietly swept aside. Yet inscriptions unearthed at Lanuvium, Lavinium, and even under the Forum Romanum show that the Silvian kings were once revered. Their names were invoked in oaths, sigils found in early tombs. So why erase them? Because Rome needed a fresh origin, and these kings were inconvenient. The politics of a new beginning. Let's step back. By the 4th century BCE, Rome was no longer a scrappy republic. It was expanding, swallowing neighbors, rebranding gods, rewriting treaties, and to unify its growing territories, Rome needed a clean, common identity. One that didn't belong to Alba Longa or Lavinium or the Volsci or the Sabines. One that started with Rome itself. So the story of Romulus and Remus was emphasized. Romulus was divine-born. Romulus killed his brother as Rome would kill its rivals. Romulus named the city after himself. It was the perfect founding myth. Brutal, bold, and Roman, the Silvian kings, with their priesthoods and councils and complex alliances, they were too soft. To Latin, to ancient Rome was no longer a child of Alba. It was a new god. And so, the scribes sharpened their styluses, and the names of Rome's real ancestors began to fade. The broken inscriptions of Lavinium, 1965. An excavation in Lavinium uncovered a series of votive altars, 17 in total, each marked with a name. One bore the inscription, to Silvius the Builder, founder of the Southern Gate. The carving was intentionally defaced, not weathered, not cracked by time, but chiseled, each line scratched out, each letter scarred. And not just that altar. 3 others bore similar wounds, a systematic erasure. Why would a city destroy its own sacred names? Because Lavinium, like Alba, had been absorbed by Rome. Its shrines were preserved, but its history rewritten. The Silvian name, once central to its identity, was now an echo. Rome wanted softened, fragments in the Forum under the stones of the Roman Forum. Near the ancient Lapis Niger, archaeologists in the 19th century found fragments of what may be one of Rome's oldest inscriptions, written in a pre-Latin script. It speaks of a rex, a sacred boundary, and a set of laws. One name is almost legible, Sil. Ius. It's possible this stone once honored a Sylvian ruler. Perhaps it's the very first king to formalize boundaries between tribes. But again, the stone was cracked, liberally buried beneath later constructions. Above it, Rome raised arches in temples. Beneath it, the founders, before Romulus, were silenced. The silence of the priestly records, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, maintained a detailed set of annals, calendars, births, deaths, eclipses, and sacrifices. Earlier, records mention the Feast of the Silver Crown, a ritual said to honor the first king of the hill. Later versions of the festival rename it the Festum, Romuli. And by the time of Augustus, the Sylvian connection had vanished. It wasn't just political history being altered. It was sacred memory. Rome wasn't content to forget. It had to make forgetting holy. The questions left behind: why was Silvius, or the many Silvi, so dangerous to remember? Was it their Latin identity, their decentralized leadership, or did their traditions clash with what Rome later became? Perhaps Romulus was never a man, just a symbol, an answer to the inconvenient truth that Rome had many fathers and chose to remember only one. But if the Sylvian kings truly laid the groundwork, the roads, the rituals, the alliances, then Rome's greatness came not from a Shival's bite, but from generations of leaders, now barely named, who tried to erase the real founder of Rome. Not a single emperor, not a wicked scribe, but the slow machinery of power. One line removed from the calendar, one name chipped off a stone, one festival renamed, and then nothing. The city of Rome is known for remembering. Its marble arches tell stories of conquest. Its coins carry the faces of emperors long dead. Its roads still bear the grooves of ancient wagons, and its ruins whisper the names of gods and generals in every crack. But sometimes the most powerful act is forgetting. Not loud, it's not dramatic, just a slow turning away. In this second section, we follow how Rome, brick by brick, built its identity, not just on victories, but on omissions. How the names of the Sylvian kings, once honored in rituals in stone, were buried under centuries of curated memory. Let's begin in a room that few ever entered, the atrium of the pontiffs, the hall where time was written in ancient Rome. Religious and civic memory were one. Inside the Regia, the house of the kings turned temple headquarters. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's high priest, kept scrolls recording every festival, anomaly, war, and omen. These were not public. They were sacred. The scrolls included birth lines, omens, and lineages from the time of Aeneas to Romulus, and well beyond. But something strange happens when you trace the scrolls back. The names leading up to Romulus are faint, uncertain, often only half remembered, and some, like Silvius, the lawgiver, mentioned in early temple graffiti, are gone entirely. Scholars in the 1st century BCE noted this. Marcus Terentius Varro, Rome's great antiquarian, once complained that in the age before Romulus, too many names have been lost to deliberate neglect. Varro wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. He suspected some names were removed or ignored to make Romulus seem like a beginning, not a continuation, a political convenience wrapped in religious silence. The tombs that no longer speak. When Augustus came to power, he restructured memory. He famously declared, Res Gesta Divi Augusti. These are the deeds of the divine Augustus. He meant for history to start anew. He even had bronze pillars carved with his achievements, so future generations could not erase him, and in doing so, taught the state to control what survived. Augustus began funding temple restorations, but only if they honored Rome's official myth. Old tombs without known lineages were cleared. Shrines to Sylvian ancestors were rededicated to newer, cleaner versions of the past. In one striking example, an early Latin tomb east of the Aventine hill was found to contain bones ritually burned and arranged, a common Sylvian funerary rite. Later, the Flavian period, this tomb was cleared. Its carvings were defaced, and a new inscription marked it, unknown citizen of Romulus tribe. One man's erased legacy became another man's building block. The libraries that burned conveniently 48 BCE. The Library of Alexandria was partially destroyed during Caesar's siege. Rome, of course, blamed the accident of war, but some records from that fire were never again referenced, including early Etruscan and Latin tribal scrolls. Among them were believed to be treaties between Abalanga and early Greek colonies, documents that may have credited Sylvian kings with cross-Mediterranean diplomacy. In Rome itself, multiple temple libraries burned mysteriously. The Temple of Juno Moneta, where many early city records were held, caught fire in 83 BCE. The tabularium, which stored civic decrees, was rebuilt several times, each time slimmer in content. We cannot say these fires were intentional, but in every case, what was lost was older than Rome's official founding. Every loss, small tear in the thread, leading to the real origins. The poet who remembered and was forgotten there was one man who tried to resist, a Latin poet named Labeo Casianus, writing around 90 BCE, devoted a trilogy to the kings before Rome. His work, The Silver Crown, explored the Sylvian line in lyrical verse. He spoke of their rituals, their city plans, their laws handed down in sacred knots rather than scrolls. He even described a Sylvian king who refused to sacrifice captives to Mars, a stark contrast to Romulus's bloody rites. But only fragments of Labio's poems remain, not because they weren't copied, but because later scribes marked them as non-essential or incorrect. Labeo was never exiled. Kay's books were not burned. They were simply not copied again. And in the age before printing, not being copied meant disappearing. It was the softest kind of censorship, the kind that doesn't punish, only forgets. The statues without names. Rome was filled with statues. Men of marble lined the streets, their togas crisply folded, their sandals worn just so. Some had inscriptions. This, especially the older ones. Did not modern archaeologists have found dozens of statues beneath newer constructions, buried intentionally with care, but no plaque? One theory suggests these were depictions of Sylvian kings, once revered in forums of pre-Roman Latin towns. Rather than destroy them, early Roman leaders may have simply covered them up. An old king turned into anonymous stone, not honored, not condemned, just ignored. How many kings, builders, lawgivers, how many Sylvi are standing silently beneath Rome's streets today, when erasure became patriotism by the time of Hadrian? In the 2nd century CE, the Romulus story was no longer just a founding myth. It was doctrine. It was to question Rome. Hadrian had statues of Romulus built across the empire. Coins bore the image of the she-wolf. Public games reenacted Romulus drawing the city's sacred boundaries. When asked about the Sylvian kings, Hadrian's own court historian, Suetonius, wrote, "They are best left to the poets." It wasn't denial, it was dismissal. To remember the Sylvian kings was now to remember a version of Rome that didn't fit, a version that wasn't born in violence. It's a version that came not from one hero, but from many elders, too soft, too complicated, too Roman.a memory beneath the ashes and. Yet, fragments remain. A clay tablet found in a field near Lanuvium bears the etched words, "Silvius, who built the 7th road to the Hill of Sheep. May his hands be remembered." The Hill of Sheep is thought to be an old term for the Palatine, Rome's central hill. If true, this would mean that a Sylvian king built infrastructure on the very hill where Romulus would later claim to found the city. And yet, his name is not in any Roman schoolbook. His road was renamed, his hands forgotten. But clay remembers what parchment burns. Stone holds the memory, even when voices do not dot so. Why was he erased? Why was Sylvius, or the mini Sylvie, erased? 'Cause Rome did not rise from nothing. It rose from villages, from alliances, from shared gods and borrowed rituals. But that truth is messy. It doesn't fit the image of divine founding, sudden greatness. Rome needed a clean slate, a first king, a she-wolf, a brother betrayed. Wall built and defended. Sylvius didn't fit. He was a consensus builder, a priest king, a negotiator. And history prefers drama. So instead of one Rome built from many, we remember the one built by Romulus and the founders who came before. Were laid gently in the dark, but their fingerprints remain. A buried inscription, a chipped altar, a poem nobody reads, a road that doesn't point to Romulus' hut, but to the silent spaces between myth and memory. And in those quiet places, the real founders still wait. Rome is a city of echoes. Each step on its cobbled streets lands on the ghost of another. Beneath its basilicas lie temples. Beneath its temples, homes. Beneath its homes, something older, something unnamed. In this final section, we descend beneath the surface, not just of the city, but of memory itself, to uncover the last surviving traces of the founder Rome forgot. And we ask, what does it mean? Not to be remembered, but to be deliberately unremembered. The buried foundation stones beneath the Palatine Hill. Archaeologists have found walls that predate Rome's supposed founding in 753 BCE. They are not Etruscan. They are not Greek. They belong to an early Latin culture, one with advanced building techniques, ritual patterns, and civic planning. One such wall curves in a perfect crescent. It's not defensive, not enclosing, ritual. And near this wall, a foundation stone bore an inscription, harassed by weather, but still readable under infrared scan. To Sylvius, who counted the shadows. It is one of the only physical mentions of Sylvius found in Rome itself. But even here, there is uncertainty. The tablet was removed quietly. It was not displayed in the Capitoline Museum. For years, it remained in storage, mislabeled as Latin votive peace, unknown purpose. Why? Because, to confirm, Sylvius, as an architect of the Palatine, would mean rethinking Romulus. It would mean the founding myth is not a spark, but an ember from an earlier flame dawn. The silence in the Senate records there. It's a small collection of texts called the Fragmenta Vaticanis Scraps, a Roman senatorial. Minutes that survived only in partial quotes by later writers. Among them is one entry, dated vaguely to the 2nd century BCE. The stone of Sylvius, placed at the curve of the northern hill, shall not be moved, though no feast shall be held. There, it is a strange line, a stone acknowledged, but not celebrated, a site maintained, but kept outside ritual life. Why would the Senate record such a thing? Because someone must have tried to move it, or question it, or repurpose it, and someone else said no. They didn't honor Sylvius. But they didn't erase him either. They quarantined gem and stone, the forgotten feast, in the early Roman religious calendar. Every day had a purpose. There were feast days for Janus, Mars, Juno, the Lares, the Penates. But before Romulus, there were other gods, local deities of grove, river, and cloud. One of these was Volterus, a river god, once honored by the Sylvian kings in the Fasti Antiochs. The oldest known Roman calendar, there is a marked space on August 27th labeled VOL turn ALIA, but no rituals are listed, only a blank space by the time of the late Republic. Volternalia was a forgotten feast. Romans didn't know how to observe it. The priests of Jupiter didn't teach it, and no temple to Volcanus stood in the city, because Volcanus was not the god of Romulus. He was the god of the Sylvi, and to honor him, was to remember a time when Rome had not yet declared itself the center of the world. The river that was renamed, the ancient river that flowed near Alba Longa, the capital of the Silvian dynasty, was once called the Numicus. It appears in early Latin poetry and in fragments of Etruscan maps, but by the time of Livy and Ovid, it was called the Almanand, later forgotten altogether. The Numicus was where Aeneas was said to have vanished into divinity. It was sacred, but the name Numicus vanished from Roman vocabulary. Why? Because every trace of the Silvian world had to be either absorbed or erased. Numicus was absorbed, recast as part of the Aeneas myth, with no mention of Silvius or his descendants. The river remained, the name did not. The ghost on the coins in the reign of Emperor Claudius, a short-lived coin was minted with an unusual design. On one side, the face of Claudius, as expected. On the other, a crowned figure holding a staff beside a laurel tree, and the words SILVFVR, Pax. The inscription has puzzled numismatists for centuries. Some read it as Sylvanus Veran's Pax. Sylvanus brings peace through fury. But Sylvanus, the rustic woodland god, is usually shown with animals, not crowns. Others believe it reads, Silvius founder, bringer of peace. The coin was recalled within a year. Only 7 copies survive, all found in southern Italy. Claudius was known for eccentric historical interests. He once tried to restore forgotten Etruscan rituals. Perhaps this coin was part of that impulsive, brief revival of the older story, before being pulled back into silence. The philosophers who whispered Seneca, the Roman philosopher and advisor to Nero, never wrote about Silvius directly, but in his Natural Questions, he posed this thought: who shall name the man who built the first fire pit, when the record honors only those who burned cities? He wasn't talking about Silvius, but he might as well have been. Roman memory favored violence. The kings and generals remembered were those who conquered, not those who constructed, mediated, or maintained. To be the first, in Roman terms, was to win. Silvius F. He was real, was not a winner. He was a weaver of laws, not a breaker of nicks. And so he was passed over, even in philosophy. His story had to hide behind a metaphor, the cost of forgetting today. Every schoolchild hears the story. Romulus founded Rome. He killed his brother, drew a wall. He vanished in a storm. It's a powerful tale, simple, sharp, enduring. But under it lies another tale of lineages that lasted longer than Romulus ruled. O builders whose names were scrubbed from calendars. Of laws older than the 12 tables. Of kings who ruled not with sword, but with sacred order. To forget them is not just to lose names, it is to lose alternatives. We teach history as though it moves in one direction, toward greatness, toward empire, toward marble and iron. But what if Rome had remembered Silvius? What if his identity had come from law, not legend? From compromise, not conquest? We'll never know. But in the cracks of the Forum, in the buried stones of the Palatine, keen, in the coins too strange to spend, we find his breath. Not loud, not triumphant, just present, waiting,